My name is Alex, and for over 12 years, I worked as a detective in a major city. I thought I was serving justice, solving crimes, and helping victims. But over time, I started to see things that shattered my understanding of the law. What I've discovered about how cases are handled, how evidence is manipulated, and how crimes are covered up will shock you. This isn't what they tell you in crime dramas. This is the truth. I stayed silent for so long, but now I can't hold back anymore. If I don't share this, then nothing will change. What I'm about to reveal will make you question everything you think you know about justice and the police. At first, being a detective was exactly what I thought it would be. I worked long hours, investigated cases, and fought to solve crimes. It was fulfilling. But the more I got into the job, the more I realized that there were systems in place that kept certain things from being exposed. Cases that were too big, too high profile, or too politically sensitive were handled very differently. What I thought was a system of justice turned out to be a system of manipulation. I began to see patterns in the way cases were handled. Cases involving powerful people or corporate interests were swept under the rug. It wasn't about solving the crime. It was about controlling the narrative. I saw how the department would bury evidence or delay investigations if they didn't want certain stories getting out. The public was kept in the dark, and the truth was often obscured by those in power. One night, I was working a case involving a high-ranking politician who had been allegedly involved in a hit-and-run accident. I was supposed to gather evidence and follow the usual protocol, but something didn't sit right. When I started digging into the case, I found that the initial investigation had been rushed. Key witnesses were never interviewed, and crucial surveillance footage had mysteriously disappeared. I pushed harder, and that's when I found the real shocker. The mayor's office had been involved from the start. I had been told to drop the investigation and reclassify the case. The message was clear: protect the powerful, no matter what. I was a pawn in a much bigger game, and I realized that justice wasn't the priority. Maintaining political power was. It wasn't just this case. As I went through the archives, I began uncovering. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deeply corruption ran. The system wasn't about solving crimes. It was about making sure that the right people didn't get caught. Powerful people, corporations, and government officials were using the police force to protect their interests. I learned that cases involving certain individuals were managed behind closed doors to ensure that no one was held accountable. I was shocked to discover how often cases involving police misconduct were quietly dismissed. I saw officers covered up their own wrongdoings, and investigations into them were either mishandled or closed prematurely. And it wasn't just the police. Lawyers, judges, even politicians were all part of a system designed to protect those with the most influence. The law wasn't blind, it was controlled. I also discovered that in some cases, police departments would deliberately avoid investigating certain crimes, especially if they involved wealthy or influential individuals. The decisions weren't about justice. They were about making sure powerful people stayed out of prison, even if that meant destroying evidence, intimidating witnesses, or falsifying reports. As I kept digging, I stumbled upon something I didn't expect. A case involving a well-known CEO who had been linked to multiple criminal activities, including illegal arms deals. When I reviewed the case file, I was horrified to find that the evidence against him was strong. Yet somehow the investigation had been shut down. The reason? Political connections. High-ranking officials had blocked the investigation and prevented it from moving forward. But there was more. The CEO had been connected to several other high-profile figures in the city, all of whom had a vested interest in keeping his crimes hidden. I realized that this wasn't just about one case. It was about a network of people who had learned how to use the police and the judicial system to protect themselves and their interests. The most chilling part? The deeper I went, the more I realized how many of these cases were still active. There were files locked away in the department of people who were involved in these cover-ups. People still working inside the system. It was all connected, and I was just a small part of a much larger conspiracy. I had a decision to make: continue working within the system or expose what I had found and risk everything. I knew if I went public, my career was over. I had seen too much. I'd be discredited, silenced, and possibly even targeted. But I couldn't live with myself knowing what I knew. I had to do something. I started secretly gathering evidence and reaching out to journalists I trusted. But the closer I got to exposing the truth, the more dangerous things became. I started receiving anonymous threats, warnings to stop investigating, and even threats to my family. The more I pushed, the more I realized how deep the corruption ran. This wasn't just about police misconduct, it was about the entire justice system being manipulated by the powerful. The moment I went public with what I knew, the backlash was immediate. My job was gone. I was blacklisted in law enforcement. My life became a nightmare. But the worst part? The system worked exactly as it was designed to. The media coverage was twisted to discredit me, and the truth was buried. But I knew what I had done was right. I had exposed something that was bigger than any one case. The justice system wasn't about protecting the innocent. It was about protecting the powerful and keeping everyone else in line. Even now, I know I'm still being watched. I'm no longer a part of that system, but the truth is still hidden, and it's up to people like you to make sure it doesn't stay buried. If you want to know more about what really goes on behind the scenes in law enforcement, like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. We expose the truth that others are too afraid to talk about, because the real criminals are the ones hiding in plain sight. My name is Laura, but for my own safety, I can't reveal my real identity. I worked as a caregiver for elderly people for over 10 years. I thought it was a noble profession, helping those who couldn't take care of themselves, giving them the dignity they deserved. But after years of doing this work, I began to see things that no one tells you about. The truth is far from the warm, compassionate image people have of caregiving. The system is broken, and I can't stay silent any longer. I've seen firsthand how elderly people are mistreated, ignored, and even exploited. What goes on behind closed doors isn't just disturbing, it's dangerous. If you think your loved ones are getting the care they need, you might want to think again. When I first started, I believed that caregiving was all about compassion and helping those in need. I went in with good intentions, feeding, bathing, and providing emotional support to elderly people who couldn't take care of themselves. But quickly I began. The owners of these facilities were more concerned about cutting costs and making profits than actually providing quality care. The elderly residents were treated like numbers, not people. Staff were underpaid, overworked, and undertrained. Many of them didn't care about the residents at all, as long as they kept up appearances. I remember countless times when I would try to report neglect or abuse, only to be told to keep quiet. If I made waves, I was warned that I'd lose my job. It wasn't until I became close with one of the families that I truly started to see how deep the corruption ran. One of the elderly patients I cared for, Mrs. Thompson, had a son who would visit regularly. He was a kind man, always asking about his mother's health. But one day, he came to me privately and told me something shocking. He'd started to notice discrepancies in his mother's medical bills. I decided to dig deeper. I spent hours going over her records and noticed a pattern. Medications she never received were charged to her account, and services were logged that were never performed. It was a clear case of fraud. The facility was charging families for things they weren't providing, and this wasn't isolated. It was happening across the board. I started investigating more cases. Patients were being over-medicated to keep them docile, while the facility collected insurance money and government benefits. But the most chilling discovery, some elderly people were being kept in these facilities not because they needed care, but because they were seen as a source of revenue. The facility was more profitable with them there, collecting payments from both the state and families. The deeper I dug, the more I found. I began noticing that some patients were receiving care that was not only inadequate, it was outright dangerous. Medication dosages were wrong, sometimes leading to serious side effects. Care plans were altered without consent, and families were lied to about their loved one's condition. And the abuse, it wasn't just about neglect. I witnessed physical abuse firsthand. One of the male residents had a tendency to wander, so staff would restrain him. I saw them use physical force to keep him in his room, leaving him terrified. And when I reported it, nothing happened. They simply moved him to another wing and swept it under the rug. It became clear to me, the system wasn't about taking care of people. It was about making money at their expense. Caregivers were instructed to turn a blind eye to abuse, and if we spoke out, we were replaced. Families were left in the dark, paying thousands of dollars for inadequate care, while these facilities raked in profits. One day, I had to make a choice. I had gathered enough evidence to expose what was going on, but I was terrified. If I spoke out, I knew I'd lose everything: my job, my reputation, and possibly even my safety. I had already seen what happened to other staff members who tried to speak out about the corruption. They were blacklisted, silenced, and sometimes even threatened. But then something happened that pushed me to my breaking point. I arrived one morning to find that one of my patients, Mr. Daniels, had been severely injured overnight. His head was bruised and he couldn't remember how it happened. I immediately suspected foul play, but when I went to report it, I was told to stay quiet. That's when I realized I wasn't just part of a broken system, I was enabling it. The people I was supposed to be helping were being abused, and I wasn't doing enough to stop it. I couldn't live with that guilt anymore. I decided I had to act. I started documenting everything. The fraud, the neglect, the abuse. I gathered as much evidence as I could without putting myself in immediate danger. Then I reached out to a journalist who had covered similar cases in the past. I knew exposing the truth could destroy my life, but I couldn't let these people suffer anymore. It was time to bring the darkness into the light. But as I prepared to speak out, the threats started. I got calls in the middle of the night telling me to stay quiet. My personal information was being leaked, and I started to feel the pressure mounting. I knew I had to be careful, but I also knew I had to finish what I started. The moment I went public with what I knew, the repercussions were swift. The facility I worked at denied everything, and I was immediately fired. They tried to discredit me, painting me as an unreliable, disgruntled employee. But the truth was out there now, and I couldn't undo what I had done. I had exposed the corruption, but the fight wasn't over. Since then, I've had to live with the consequences. Lost friends, job opportunities, and the constant threat of retaliation. But I know I made the right choice. The elderly deserve better than this. The families deserve better than this. What you see on the surface, the nice buildings and caring smiles, isn't the full story. Behind those closed doors, there's a system that profits off the most vulnerable people in society. I can't change what happened, but I can make sure you know the truth. If you want to learn more about the exploitation happening behind closed doors, comment and subscribe. We need to expose this system and demand better for our elderly. Don't let these people be forgotten, because they deserve so much more.